Hello, and welcome to another video session in the series for AWS Well-Architected Framework. And today we're going to talk about the cost optimization pillar. And just like all the other pillars, we'll start with looking at the design principles, and then we'll switch over to the tool in AWS console and look at the well-architected tool and go through all the questions and explore all the options and see how to answer them in the best possible way for your scenarios. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to share my screen here. All right, so from a design principles perspective, we're talking about cost optimization. So, a lot of this cost optimization is going to focus on looking at data, measuring what you're doing, and evaluating whether or not it's being cost effective. So, having a good cloud financial management system is going to be absolutely required. What you want is you want some sort of a dedicated function in the organization that's looking at your cost and also whether or not this cost is being optimized for extracting the maximum value that you can for the money that's being spent on these different programs, different resources that you're using in the cloud, but are they creating the kind of value that you expected them to? And typically, having a separate function that focuses on that allows them to get more familiar with the tools, with the different models that can help with optimize those things, and really support the organization in a way that becomes a more specialized function. Similar to how you would do that with a separate information security team or a separate operations team, you want to also have a team that's focusing primarily on the cloud cost optimization or the cloud financial management aspect of it. So that varies in different organizations. Some organizations work with their existing finance teams and help them upskill to manage also the cloud views to things and the cloud implementation of their resources. But in some teams, we found that it works in a better way if they're able to dedicate certain other resources or a smaller team that's focusing more on the cloud financial management portion. Adopting a consumption model, this is part of taking a look at what you're using and are you using it in the best possible way. So things like when you've got a dev team that's working specifically within the business hours and they're doing the development work in that time, and they're not actually going to be using the test environment or the dev environment in the evenings or over the weekend. And if that is the case, then you establish a model in which you turn off those resources or you stop those resources after hours. That way you actually are not paying for any of those development and test environment resources that are dedicated to them, and you're basically reducing all that cost. And then the next design principle is to measure overall efficiency. Like I said, everything around cost is going to be deeply rooted into measurements. So looking at what you're paying, but also looking at what is the value that's being created for that money, measuring that business output and the costs that were associated with with delivering that particular business output, and then using this data to actually figuring out where you need to reduce your cost, where you need to increase the kind of functionality that you're providing, or maybe there are tools that are being used or that you're already paying for, and you're not using all of the features and capabilities, but you're paying for other tools that provide the corresponding functionality. And so it may be more cost efficient when you look at the overall picture to say, why don't we just use one tool and use all of its features rather than providing multiple tools and then having to pay for all these different tools. So giving this an overall look is going to help you see where you can optimize across different areas and not just optimize within that one tool or within that one particular functionality. This next design principle is focused on the term that AWS likes to use a lot is which is undifferentiated heavy lifting, and that's basically stuff that can be done by anybody, and it does not provide any specific business value or differentiation for your particular service or offering or product that you have. Things that go completely behind the scenes and are not going to be creating any specific intellectual property for what you're doing in your business. So managing, the infrastructure, looking at the data center stuff that needs to be done at the hardware level, even like some basic networking things. These are items that you don't need to have as a dedicated function within your own organization. This is something you can offload to a business partner, and they can manage those things for you, and it will not make a difference in the way you create your products or your services or you deliver your services. And so when you identify those kind of technology areas where you can potentially outsource or offload those things to somebody else, that's what we call as managed services. The idea is to try and uh, prefer or lean towards use of managed services rather than maintaining those services yourself, because that allows you to have a more optimized cost model. And also you've got more specialized teams that are working on those areas, and they can give you a higher value for that money being spent, rather than having your own team focusing on all this extra overhead. And what that does is it also frees up your money to actually maybe get more specialized resources or more specialized team members that can take your own product or service to the next level. And so this optimization is really key to how you create better value from the cloud. And then analyzing and attributing that expenditure. So this design pattern is more about making sure that you're tagging your costs in a way that you can identify which team, which workload, which business function has what cost associated with it. And so you're able to then evaluate and analyze that to say, okay, maybe we're spending too much money on this one service that's not actually creating that much revenue for us. So maybe, make a decision where you either have that particular function create more value, so that you can increase your revenue, or maybe you just completely decide to turn it off and not provide that particular function anymore because it's not worth it. But if you don't analyze it, if you don't have that attribution in place, then there is no way for you to know which functions are actually being worth it and which ones are not. And you basically you're carrying all that cost all the time, and it's harder to optimize your spend at that point of time. So these are some things to keep in mind as you architect your applications, as you look at taking on new workloads, new applications, and systems. And so as you think about all of these pieces, and you also train your team to think about all of these different aspects of how to factor cost into all your decisions, then you will start to see that shift happening across your entire organization, where you become more efficient from a cost perspective across all of your workloads. Now, let's look at the questions that will help the team actually get more comfortable with and familiar with asking themselves whether they're doing all the right things from a cost efficiency perspective. So let's look at the first question, which is, how are you implementing your cloud financial management? Cloud financial management can be a separate team, like I mentioned. It can be, a function within just the core ITS or the leadership team that you have. But whichever way it is, there needs to be something that becomes a dedicated focus on looking at cost and its optimization. Having that partnership between finance and technology, it's also going to be key, where the technology teams are able to explain to the finance people, what are they spending money on and why they need to spend money on those things. And then the finance teams can also share back with the technology architects and solution architects that where the constraints are, where they're seeing high value of the technology that's been committed to, and where there is low value. And this feedback loop also helps the technology folks make different decisions on how to maximize the value that can be generated. Establishing cloud budgets and forecasts, that's another good aspect of the cloud, is that you're able to look at what kind of resources you're using, what are the costs associated with them, and you can project out what sort of spend you anticipate in a particular month or over a period of time. And so using that projection to plan out how much you expect to spend, and then setting your budgets based on what you do need to have in place, will help the teams get a better sense of, if I'm budgeted for $100 to spend on a particular application on a monthly basis, and every month, the actuals are that we're spending, say, $125 on that. Then if you're going to be exceeding your budgets, then obviously you're going to run out of your allocated budget for the year sooner than your entire year. And so you want to use that as a way to forecast, and as part of your partnership with the finance team, let them know that, hey, we budgeted in a way that we thought we would have a usage pattern, but what we are observing with actual usage is our spend is a little bit higher. And while you may implement certain controls to reduce your spend, you can optimize some of the technical functions, but in some cases that may not be an option, and you may end up finding yourself that you have to spend more money to support the particular functions that you have. And in that case, the conversation back with the finance team early on is more useful and more effective, because then the finance team can help you by identifying other areas where they can free up budget, and then either increase your budget because now you need more money to support the systems, or they can work with the rest of the business teams to figure out whether a different decision needs to be made about how we are spending money on this technology. And I've been in personally, I've been in situations where these kind of conversations have really helped nail down the kind of model we need to have in place. And we've made some tough decisions. We've made some, let's keep it going, wait and watch kind of decisions also at times. So the more transparent you are about what you expect to see and what's actually happening, and the more you monitor it, the easier it becomes to have these cost conversations. That which really feeds into the next piece, which is implementing cost awareness in your organizational process, where as you look at the different decisions, how information flows up the chain to leadership, and how they talk back to the entire organization and share their vision and the objectives and goals. If it is tied back to a cost conversation, and being aware of we need to spend money to do all of these things that we talk about, then it just it brings up that topic in a more effective way. And if everybody's aware that there is a spend that is associated with every request that comes in, then they'll have to find a way to also justify the value of what that ask is, and not just keep on asking for things or resources without really putting any thought into how much it's going to cost, and how are we actually going to pay for it. So that's a mindset shift that is helpful across the organization. Reporting and notifying on cost optimization is part of the cloud finance management function, where they look at monthly reports, and they can also set alerts where they get notified about any unexpected spend, any spikes that happen. And so that can let the teams know that their resources are being utilized more than what they had anticipated, and so they may want to make adjustments to that, right? So that notification is really important. And we obviously want to monitor that cost proactively. You don't just want to look at the bill at the end of the month and find out that, oh, hey, there was an unexpected spend that happened this month, but rather you want to know as soon as that spend increases or goes beyond what was the expected amounts, and you want to know earlier in the month that there is a big spike, rather than at the end of the month where it's now it's too late to do anything about it. So that proactive cost monitoring, which again goes back to the cost optimization function, somebody who's dedicated to looking at these things and who understands how to perform the trend analysis, how to look at what does it mean when something changes on a day-to-day basis, where it projects out to a larger number change at the end of the month. Those are the pieces that somebody who's part of the cost optimization team will be well equipped to respond to and identify the significance of those changes, as compared to other team members who might not be paying too much attention to that number because they've got other things going on, other higher priority issues that they might have to deal with, and so cost becomes something to deal with later. And we don't want to give it that kind of treatment. And staying up to date with new service releases is another important part of cost optimization. What we've seen as a trend is with AWS specifically, as they release new services and new features, they tend to encourage users or teams to start using the new features by providing them at a lower cost. Like, if you've got an older generation of an EC2 instance, you'll typically find that the same equivalent set of resources in a newer generation of that EC2 instance is at a lower per hour cost. Similarly, with EBS volumes, like if you've got an older generation of an EBS volume, by migrating that to a newer generation of the EBS volume, you actually end up paying less money, and that's AWS's way of encouraging you to migrate over to the newer versions, and then they can retire the old versions because now eventually nobody will nobody will use them, and that helps AWS obviously optimize their own cost, and that they're transferring that those savings back to all of the customers and users. So having that again as part of your design process, your architectural review process, to see what are the new services coming in, how can we incorporate that into our process or into our into our technology stack, is an important cost optimization function to keep in mind. Now, cost obviously in AWS and in cloud in general is a function of usage. So the better you can govern your usage, there's a direct correlation to how much your cost is going to be. Developing some policies that allow you to sort of put guardrails around where money can be spent, what kind of resources can be used, is one of the ways that you can reduce the kind of cost that you will incur. So if, let's say, there are certain regions that you don't expect to be operating in, then just having a policy that denies resources from being generated or created in those regions will obviously make it easier for you to control what somebody may unexpectedly do on the team without realizing that they were creating resources in a different region, which might be at a higher cost, and or they may just bypass the entire process. So you don't want that happening. You want policies at an organizational wide level to restrict the kind of things that you don't want the teams to do. And if they have a real use case for doing those actions, then it has to come back to the governing body. Somebody has to review it and accept that either as an exception or a change to the policy to allow that particular resource to be created. The next one around implementing goals and targets. This is more around identifying your goals as an organization or as a business, and then setting targets, which are measurable metrics or KPIs that will help you see whether or not you're moving towards your goal or not. As an example, a goal may be that we want to reduce our cost for our a particular application over the next 6 months. If that's the goal, then you may want to set your targets as just looking at the total cost of the application on a month-to-month basis, and then setting a target to say, right now we're spending $100 on this. Our target is to get it down to $90 within $90 a month within 3 months. I'm just making it up. So if that aligns with your goal of reducing cost. In some cases, the goal may be to increase the value that you're generating from your cloud resources. In that case, you're not actually saying that we'll spend less money, but rather you're saying that we will extract more value out of whatever resources we do put out there. And so in that kind of a goal, you may want to set your target, which factors in, say, your revenue and your total cost of cloud. And then as a function of those two, you may say, what's my revenue per dollar spent on the cloud? And that may, that factor may come out to be some number, and then you can use that as a target to say we want to improve that number over the next 3 to 6 months, and then you track that that value of how much revenue is being generated versus how much you're spending on your cloud resources. What that kind of a target and a goal combination helps with is in a scenario where, let's say, you want to implement a new service which is probably at a high cost, say machine learning, AI, that kind of new field functionality. You you may spend that much money. That will obviously increase your cost. But what you find is by rolling out a new feature of that sort, you're actually you know able to increase your revenue a lot more. And so when that happens, you're basically showing that a slight increase in cost is having a higher impact on our revenue, and that ratio is what improves, and it helps you meet your goal. And so having a clear identification or definition of what is it that you're trying to get done, and then having the right measure for what you're trying to get done is important. And those things change the way you look at cost, and the money being spent on it, either as a constraint or as a resource to use towards a higher goal. All right. The next one is around implementing an account structure. So this also helps towards maintaining, structure and control. This ties back to the AWS organizations function or service that's available. And what that does is it basically, creates a set of accounts and a hierarchy in those accounts, which typically should map back to your organizational hierarchy. And that allows you to create, security controls around who can do what in each of these different accounts, and as part of a tree or a subtree. But it also allows you to create some service control policies that can be applied at any level of that tree to say, we want everybody in this particular department to only have access to 5 services. But in this other department, which is dealing with, say, innovation or some of the some lab oriented work, then we want them to have access to all services. And so what you can do is you can actually create SCPs that apply differently to these different subtrees. And so somebody who's in the controlled tree will not be able to create any resources outside of the allowed services. And then somebody in the other tree is, allowed to do that. And that also helps you reduce the cost, because now your controlled tree resources and people who work there are not going to be able to do anything, and they don't have to work through. You don't have to have additional monitoring on them. You don't have to keep looking at their reports, because you know for sure that they cannot create those additional services or resources based on the rules or the policies that you've established. In line with that is the next piece around implementing groups and roles. What you want to do is you want to have specific roles and created that allow specific actions, and you want to have groups identified where you have you add users into those groups, and what you do is you assign permissions for what each role or each group is allowed to do to that role or group. And so if let's say somebody is a developer, they may be part of a development group and have a development role associated with them, which gives them permissions to just run resources in the development account. But the same person, when they go and work in the production account, they have to adopt a separate role, which will prevent them from, say, creating new resources in the production account, but only let them read what's deployed there. And so this allows, this obviously helps control the cost that you will have across each of these different accounts. Implementing cost controls is similar to the, making sure that you've got the right level of policies in place that will limit the cost that you can have from any of these resources and services that you can use. Use of quotas and limits also applies here, because if you're limiting the number of resources that can be created, then obviously that's a direct correlation to having a cost control on it. And then tracking project lifecycle, identifying which projects are in the initial stage where they may end up spending a little bit more money because they're trying different things out. But then when they get into a steady state, you know that there is expected cost that's going to happen every month, and you kind of don't see variations too much at that point of time. And then once the project is over, knowing that that project is over will help the team, whoever is overseeing all of this and governing it, to go back and confirm that all the resources that should have been decommissioned have been decommissioned. We're not actually paying money for something, for a project which is no longer active, right? And that this does happen a lot, especially in on-premises environments where you've got these old legacy systems and servers running, where the work was completed, but nobody actually thought to go back and turn off those systems because it just keeps running. Right. So that mindset shift is something that's going to be important, and tracking the life cycle of a project helps with making that shift. All right. So the next one is, how do you actually monitor your usage and cost, right? So looking at all of the services that we get from AWS, there is in most services there is an option to configure detailed information sources. You can look at information being sent over to CloudWatch and into Cost Explorer, where you can see all these detailed data points and then use that towards your analysis. And then being able to tag the resources, which is identifying your cost attribution categories, having a model or a hierarchy defined. I find TBM is one of those structures that's an industry standard or widely used in the industry, where other organizations just use their organizational hierarchy as cost attribution categories, or maybe a set of departments or a set of teams, or in some cases it's functionalities or capabilities that they provide back to internal teams and external teams. So it varies, and it goes back to the way your teams want to analyze and look at where the costs are coming from or where they're going. You want to have that defined as a tree so that you can assign those tags back to each of the resources that belong to that particular category. And once you're able to do that, there are ways to tag resources at the time that they're created, or even if they're running. In some cases, some resources can be tagged, while they're running also. So what you want to do is you want to give that guidance to your teams so that as they create their infrastructure as code or the scripts that are going to generate those resources, they assign the tags while or during the creation process. That way, if it's part of the script, for sure consistently those tags will be applied. And if those tags are properly applied, then they will also feed into your cost reporting. That way, it allows you to know exactly where these resources are attributing the cost. And when you run your reports and see which department, which team, which subtree is having that spike in cost, drilling down into it and knowing exactly which team to go talk to becomes far easier, and it's a lot more effective at that point. And it also helps you establish those organizational metrics to say, what are the different budgets and goals and targets that we're setting for the different teams, so that as a usage and a cost monitoring function, you have some kind of a threshold that can be set, that you can use to say, are we doing things effectively, or is there a need for a different conversation with the team and try and optimize things? Configuring your billing and cost management tools. There are a lot of cost management tools available. AWS obviously provides its own cost management tool. That's the Cost Explorer, and cost and usage reports. But there are also third-party tools that are available that tie directly into your AWS account. They pull out all the information that they need from it, and then they provide you maybe additional functionality that makes it easier for you to analyze the information that's available to you. So having that, having those tools configured so that they can pull out the information is useful. So you want to have that early on, much before your cloud usage becomes in production use and highly mature. You want to have those things in place beforehand so that you can be sure that all of your resources are being displayed and being visible in your cost management tools, and that way you can trust that the information that's there is what you can make your decisions based on. And then adding organizational information to your cost and usage. So this goes back to the cost attribution categories, having those attribution categories aligned with your organizational information to say, this is part of the IT team, this is part of the InfoSec team, those kind of tags will help you with your usage reports and being able to slice them by different departments or by different applications or workloads, or whatever way you want to organize the information and see that information as part of your organization's view. And then you allocate costs based on workload metrics. So there may be some cases where you have shared resources, say network resources, your firewalls, and there might be some management tools that are being used, which are not really part of any one particular team. And so one of the models that we use is, depending on how much usage different teams have, you look at all of their individual usage and you kind of allocate weights or percentage of their use, and you prorate the shared services cost to the overall usage cost that is there for different workloads. So as an example, if you've got workload, 3 workloads running in an environment, and team one has workload one, which is 60% of all of the resources being used in AWS, and workload two has 10%, and workload three has, say another 10%. And the remaining 20% of the resources are all shared services. So what you would do is you would take that 20% of the shared services cost, and then you would slice that into, so it was 60, 10, and 10. So out of 80, 60 out of 80 goes to team one, 10 out of 80 goes to team two, and 10 out of 80 goes to team three. And so you distribute that 20% shared service cost across those three teams. And so that's a model by which you can allocate your costs based on those workload metrics. So that's what this final thing is talking about, where you can perform different ways or different models to make sure that you're tying back your workload level information to how cost is being allocated. All right, the next one is, now we've, if you're done using certain resources, what's your process for decommissioning them? Are you tracking them over their lifetime? Do you have a process in place that will decommission resources? In some cases, there's an operational process in place. You just kick off that process and say, here's my resource, I need to turn this off. It's an automated script that goes through and it turns off everything. It updates the CMDB, it updates other resources that need to be told. It also lets finance team know that this is now no longer going to be a cost creator, things like that. And then you actually decommission those resources, right? And then the last piece is getting to the point where you can decommission those resources in an automated fashion. So this comes back to your information infrastructure as code, or having events that will trigger the process for decommissioning if something is not needed anymore. So say, as an example, auto scaling, you've got additional instances or compute models created that are required when there is a big spike. But when that spike goes back down to normal state, that triggers the decommissioning of those extra additional instances that were created. And so that automatic decommissioning is something that will help you obviously cut down on the cost because you're no longer now using those resources. All right. So evaluating cost when you're selecting services. So this is at the early stage when you're doing your architecture, you're evaluating like how do you want to design your workload. At that stage, understanding what are your organizational requirements for cost, whether it's minimize cost or whether it is maximize value, like or something in between. Knowing that will help you make your decisions appropriately. And then look at all of the components of the workload and see, for each component, identify what are the different options to have different cost effectiveness of the services that are available. And say, you may have a compute need then evaluating that that component which has a compute need against an EC2 instance, a Lambda function, a container, things like that, and then comparing them to say which of these will become the most, which of these will be aligned most to the organizational requirement that we have for cost, will help you then make the decisions and influence your overall architecture. And then, you obviously you select the software with the most cost-effective licensing. In some cases, it's going to be AWS and it's or inbuilt services. In some cases, it may be a partner service that actually ends up becoming more cost-effective. So you have to analyze that and see which one will be the most effective in your specific scenario. And then you select components of this workload to optimize the cost in line with the organizational priorities, which goes back to like knowing what those priorities were. And then after you've deployed everything, continue to perform the cost analysis for usage over time, and then see where you may need to make adjustments to your design, your architecture, and the decisions that you had made earlier based on maybe different data or different factors. All right. So the next question is around how do you meet your cost targets when you select resource type, size, and number? So knowing that, or making sure that you're choosing the right kind of resource size and the type and even the number of resources that you need for a specific task. If you're over provisioning, then obviously you're paying a lot more than what you need. And if you're under provisioning, then at that point your outputs are getting impacted. So you want to be able to right size, and this is something that we talked about even in the reliability aspect and the performance aspect, that you want to right size and have enough data to know what level do you want to be performing at. And so doing some cost modeling, which is identifying your cost of a specific resource and then projecting it out to say, if I use this EC2 instance, which costs 10 cents an hour for the next one for the whole month, then for 720 hours, it's going to cost me $72 for the month. And I can choose, I may need 15 of this kind of instance, to do the work that I need to get done. Or I may choose another instance, which is say a lower cost, but that will require 25 of those instances. And when you combine all of those data points to say which model will work better in your situation, you choose the one that is more effective for you. And so that's, performing your cost modeling and then selecting your type, size, and number based on data. But then you can also, at a higher maturity level, what you can do is you can build that decision making into your scripts and event-based model, where you look at the metrics of how you're performing, like how each of these resources is getting, how much workload they have, are they sitting idle or not, and if based on that you may modify the resource type, the size, or even the number automatically. So you can have triggers established with your CloudWatch metrics that are looking at, say the number of requests that are coming in, or the latency that's being observed from the load balancer perspective. And if that latency goes above a certain threshold, you add on more resources. If it falls below a certain threshold, you reduce resources, right? So that automatic adjustment is part of where you're using your cost target to determine what kind of resources you want to have and how many, and then making adjustments in an automated fashion. All right, looking at pricing models to reduce cost. So you can performing a pricing model analysis basically means you're analyzing each of the components of the workload and then seeing what would happen or impact of their cost by if you have to run them over a long period of time, and then incorporate any kind of discounts that you might be getting. Say, if you're running something for a long period of time, or you're pre-committing to it with savings plans or reserved instances, then you could bring down some of the cost, right? So understanding how a certain resource will be used will help you determine if a certain other pricing model can be applied to it. The other piece is some regions, like different regions have a different cost per resource associated with them. So it's not like everything, it's not the same pricing across all the regions. So being more aware of which region is going to give you the best price. And if it is compatible with your scenario or your situation, then maybe you use a lower priced region for that particular workload. And then selecting third-party agreements with cost-efficient terms. This one is more around, where you may have certain third-party tools that you want to use, and you've got a license agreement with them when you had a direct, agreement signed with a certain third-party company. You might find that in some cases you could purchase the same service through the AWS marketplace and actually get a better price, a better cost-efficient term from the same organization. And that is because, based on the volume discounts and other agreements that third-party company might have with AWS, they can actually offer you something that is more effective for you. And so evaluating these aspects, looking at different options available to you, can help you make decisions where you may choose to go not have a direct contract with them, but rather come through the marketplace. And then sometimes, in some cases, that marketplace, because that marketplace amount ties back to your AWS bill, it may even tie back to your enterprise discount levels, where your entire total bill gets a certain discount. Then that discount is also then being applied to your marketplace commitment that you had. So that further brings down the amount that you were paying for the third-party agreement. And then implementing that pricing model for all components of the workload. This was all planning stuff, but actually implementing it for the different components and applying the right model for each of those components. So for example, RDS instances, you probably don't, there's no savings plan for that. Compute savings plan will be only for EC2 instances. And so with RDS, you may want to choose reserved instances model, for that database, and then use savings plan for your EC2 instances. And then eventually when AWS comes out with another pricing model that probably extends out to both databases and EC2 and something else, then you could switch to it, right? So the more you're aware of what's happening out there and which other services are available from AWS, the easier it is to make those adjustments and optimize things in your particular situation. And then also performing that pricing model, that analysis at the entire master account level. So all of your individual accounts, obviously their cost rolls up to that master account level. So you want to do the individual analysis, but you also want to see this, at a forest for the trees kind of a level to say, is it being optimized even at the highest level? And again, these are all things that really tie back to the idea of having a dedicated team or a dedicated function that can perform this kind of cost benefit analysis across multiple options, multiple things available. And as you can see, there's a lot of analysis to be done, which goes back to justify the need for having a dedicated function or a role that looks at cost, more or less as a full-time job. All right, and then the next piece is around planning for data transfer charges. This is more at an architectural decision making. As you're looking at your entire architecture and your application, identifying where data is going to be stored and where it's going to get consumed, you want to factor in if there is any data transfer cost between those two locations. If you're going inter-region, there is a data transfer cost for that inter-region transfer. But if you're going from AWS to on-prem or to the internet, out to the internet, then there is a separate charge for that. So there is no charge for data coming into any of the AWS regions or locations, but there is always a cost of data leaving that boundary. And so you want to design and plan for, what level of data transfer is going to happen. The modeling of that will help you identify the cost of that data transfer, and then you can implement different changes, different models to reduce that data transfer cost. For instance, if you've got data sitting in, say, S3 buckets that has to be analyzed, and you've got a tool on-prem which is going to take all that information, crunch it, come up with some kind of a decision, then all that data will have to leave S3, go back to on-prem, and have to pay for that transfer. But if you choose, I mean, if depending on the cost of that transfer, it may be worthwhile to consider bringing that data crunching application over into the same region in AWS so that it is right there with that S3 bucket with all the data. Without any extra cost, it can perform the data crunching on the S3 data, and then only the crunched, analyzed data is what then leaves AWS and goes back to your on-prem applications so that they can consume that. And that will significantly reduce your data transfer cost. So those are the things that have an impact in the overall cost of running an application because there is so much data that has to be factored in, and where the data goes out of AWS is a big factor, a big input into your planning. Okay, the next one is around managing a demand and supply resources. This is pretty much around the auto scaling aspect of the cloud, the elastic aspect of it. So making sure that you've got an analysis of how much demand is being placed on your workloads is something that will help you determine, do you have the right level of resources in place? Are you getting overutilized, right? Or are you underutilized? Or any of those things will help you evaluate where there is waste or there's unoptimized workload, and you can optimize that. Having a buffer or a throttle to manage the demand, if there is if there is a situation where it may be okay to slow things down, you could throttle some of those requests coming in. You could say, if you're overloaded, you just put a buffer space in between and you allow things to happen at a slower pace. That means you don't actually have to increase the number of workers and keep up with the increase in demand, but rather you just allow a little bit more time for that work to be completed by the same number of workers. So if there is that situation or that possibility, then you could implement that extra buffer in place instead of increasing your number of workers. So that also will control the cost that you have against that particular workload. And then supplying resources dynamically. If you don't have that option, or you may do a combination of both, where you throttle your requests, but you at the same time you also increase the number of resources that you have, which allows for that increased demand to get handled. And then when that demand goes back down, you can remove those extra resources and have that elastic model in place. So these are all things that we've talked about this in another question, but having that design in place and the architecture to support that auto scaling and elastic function is an important influence on your overall cost. And then having a process, this is around evaluating new services, having a process by which the team looks at new services, analyzes it, determines if that's going to help cut down on the cost or provide additional value, and then testing it out, trying it out, having the discussions with the finance team, the other leadership teams, like just that overall process for a workload review needs to be in place. Whether it's done quarterly, biannually, all of these things will obviously depend on the kind of workload you have, the kind of processes you have in your organization. But having a process defined and followed is an important piece. So you want to make sure that at least on a certain defined time period basis, that each workload is being reviewed and analyzed whether or not there can be any optimizations made in that process. So those are all the factors that go into optimizing your cost. And we've covered quite a few things today. And overall, from a cost perspective, I will just repeat that everything to do with cost has to really come back to monitoring what you're doing, looking at where money is being spent, and how you could optimize those things, which really comes back to your business goals. So having clarity around your business goals helps the team make the right decisions and align with and optimize towards your cost goals. So those are all the things that will be helpful, and I hope we can come back and look at more of these best practices with other services coming out from AWS. That's all for the the cost management pillar. And in the next one, we'll talk about sustainability and how that is now becoming an important factor in your decision making around architecture and how you